Hello, my name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at CUNY, City University of New York. And we're sponsored by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation for many years to do events like this to promote the art and craft of biography, among other things. And we've been a sponsor of the National Book Festival for some years. And we're here on a session with the 20th anniversary, actually, of the National Book Festival. And the theme this year is American Ingenuity. We're going to be talking tonight with two notable public intellectuals. Harold Holzer is one of the country's leading Lincoln scholars. He is currently the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. Ted Widmer is himself the author of 8 books. Professor Widmer is now in the faculty of Macaulay Honors College. Today, we will be discussing his latest book, Lincoln on the Verge, a story about the 13-day train journey that Lincoln took from Illinois to Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated as president. These are two very different books. I'm going to hold up each of them. This is literally a mini biography. Well, not so mini, it's a substantial book, but it focuses on 13 days. And this is Harold Holzer's book on the president versus the press. They're very different books, but they are both about presidents. And both authors are deeply versed in Lincoln and the Civil War era. And to my mind, both books actually have a theme, which is the notion that American politics has always been deeply partisan, contentious, and downright toxic. So, Ted, let's begin with you. You give us a vivid description of Lincoln's dangerous train journey. And at one point, you refer to the toxic climate of 1860. So I wanted to ask you right off the bat, is it worse today?
No, it's horrific today, but it was worse in 1860. It's such an honor to appear with Harold because he literally wrote the book on this period. Lincoln President-elect was constantly on my bookshelf as I was writing this new book. And so he's read every newspaper and statement by Lincoln and all of his contemporaries. And I've read a lot of them, but I think Harold has read more of them. And it was a nightmare. There was a presidency falling apart, the James Buchanan presidency, which had not been especially distinguished even in the better years that preceded 1860, but was having a strange kind of immolation. It just, Buchanan personally was failing. He was having a lot of trouble making decisions. He was trying to please very angry Southern members of his cabinet and then promising things that he couldn't really promise to the Northerners who were getting upset about his Southern promises. And the Treasury didn't have very much money. There was mounting evidence of very serious financial corruption among his cabinet, but also the sending of armaments from northern forts and armories down to southern installations, almost as if the Civil War had begun, although it hadn't yet begun. And wild rumors sweeping Washington about militias who might take over the government buildings at any moment. And Lincoln was very far away without that much power to affect anything in Washington. So as he got on that train, he really didn't know what he was going to find at the end of the journey or if he would even make it into Washington. And as I tried to show, it was a close call. He made it, but only barely.
So turning to Harold, why do you refer to the endless battle between the White House and the media? Why is it an endless battle?
I think all of our precedents go back to George Washington. And even in the founding period, when there was a distance between the president and the press, no press conferences, no scrums as Washington was ready to board his helicopter to go to the golf course. No press secretaries. There was still a partisan print press that, in a way, resembles the television dichotomy between MSNBC, say, and Fox News, or the extremes of liberal and right-wing media on the internet. So, at the beginning, Washington established a special relationship with Federalist journalists and editors who were friendly to his administration and his policies. And sort of to top anything that we hear about today about leaks that displease the current president, George Washington had a cabinet member, Thomas Jefferson, who held the highest rank in the cabinet as Secretary of State, who actually helped create an opposition newspaper in the capital, Philadelphia at the time, and not only encouraged its creation specifically to criticize the policies of George Washington, but gave its editor a job in the State Department as a translator in order to help him make his way in a new city. He had to travel to Philadelphia to set up shop. So that's, in a way, set the example of presidents being wary of and sometimes in open hostility against the press. We mentioned the inaugural journey of Lincoln. Within 6 months of that inaugural journey, Abraham Lincoln's administration was encouraging the shutdown of pro-Democratic Party, anti-Republican, specifically anti-volunteerism, volunteering for the military, newspapers. He was imprisoning editors without the writ of habeas corpus. He was closing down newspaper offices. So the antipathy has, on occasion in American history, become quite overt. And as I point out in my book, and as Ted said, not as bad as it was then. Today, the crackdowns and the complaints are nowhere near as bad as they've been under John Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, maybe even FDR in some ways.
So, Harold, let's keep with you for a moment to follow up on that. Why did you, after writing so many books about Lincoln, turn to this topic, the press and the White House? Was it because of the Trump presidency and his particularly hostile relationship with the press, or did you start this book before Trump was elected?
I started it a bit before, I would say, but I had written a book about Lincoln and his long relationship with the press, both as an anonymous journalist for the press, as a manipulator of messages, as a master of technologies that helped him get his message across. And I think I was motivated in a way, nostalgically, by my own career, which is at least as circuitous as Ted's. I started 50.
You weren't a rock star.
Right. 51 years ago, my first job was as a cub reporter, then a reporter, then an editor, as the rest of as the real professional staff peeled away for want of money, of a weekly newspaper in New York, run by a very political guy who was very closely aligned to the Kennedy family. So, and then I spent years in politics as a press secretary to political candidates, none of whom under my watch ever won an election, but that's another story. So I've seen this from several angles, and this just seemed like a natural subject to tackle, the origins of the pervasive contentiousness between presidents and journalists and the varying peaks and valleys of those relationships.
So coming back to you, Ted, you describe at one point in Lincoln's journey, you say that this was the first time a president had, quote, direct conversations with the voters, unscripted, with the media standing by. Meaning that the reporters were standing there witnessing these conversations that Lincoln would have with people along the way on the railroad journey. And then they would telegraph their accounts of these conversations to newspapers across the country. So this was really the first time that there was like an instant press conference as such, right?
I don't think that's too big a stretch, although I don't think anyone used the phrase press conference at the time. But it was a very volatile situation. And Lincoln understood very well, as Harold's work has shown, just how powerful the press was. So he had his antipathies, and he got unbelievably frustrated and angry, but he also was skillful at using the power of the press to his advantage. And he knew that reporters were listening, and there were reporters embedded on the train with him as he's coming from Springfield to Washington, some very talented reporters. And sometimes they even helped him get his message out. The very famous farewell address to Springfield was, he gave the speech, and then a few minutes later, after the train started, a reporter named Henry Villard went to Lincoln on the train as it's moving and asked him to write it out. And Lincoln, there's a famous document in the Library of Congress that shows half of the speech written by Lincoln in squiggly handwriting because the train is literally moving. And then he handed it to John Nicolay, his aide, who finished it. And then they gave it to Henry Villard, who telegraphs it to the rest of the country. And an extremely important Lincoln speech was made available because of the cooperation of a reporter. But he also got angry, and sometimes the message got distorted severely. Sometimes reporters wrote things that were not true at all. And while he's on this train, people in the South are writing, the most hateful things they can think of about him. Anything went in the Southern papers at that time.
Right. So, Ted, how did you come to write this book? I understand that it sort of emerged out of your work for the New York Times, 13 days, 13 essays. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, I feel lucky because I had been a pretty academic historian, and I thought of serious academic topics, which you could almost substitute the word tedious for serious. And this story crept up on me, and I think it was a better story for that reason. So I was working with some friends. Some were historians, some were journalists who wanted to put the story of the Civil War day by day into the online section of the New York Times at a time, this was 2010 and 11 when it began, when the online part was not considered that valuable. And it's funny because 10 years later, it's very valuable. But at the time, it was seen as sort of a less significant part of the paper's real estate. And so they gave us some space, and it was all like virtual space. So it didn't even matter. We could write fairly long pieces. And Harold contributed to the series very meaningfully. And as, I think we all kind of spurred each other on, and some of the writers were very good tellers of stories. And I would not put myself in that category, but I was lifted up by their example, and I liked how they were doing it. My friend Adam Goodhart, who Harold also knows, was really writing beautifully in those early months. And so I was just looking ahead a little bit, and I noticed that Lincoln had the train trip coming. And so February 1861 is when it happened. So February 2011 is when I was thinking about writing something. And I pitched it to the editors of the Times, and they said, sure, go for it. And so for 13 days in a row, I wrote essays about what happened on that day. And I just really fell in love with the story. I had Harold's book right on my desk then, and I read the original newspaper accounts, some of which I read on the website of the Library of Congress. And it was an immersive experience. It was a kind of adventure, and I had not really found adventure in history until this project came along.
Well, it's a very vivid tale. And I have to say, I was surprised at your ability to tell the story with such suspense. I hadn't realized how dangerous the journey was. I hadn't realized that there was indeed a very serious conspiracy to try to perhaps prevent Lincoln from actually getting to Washington. And, it reads like a thriller at times. You really learn a lot of the history, but it's very narrative driven.
Well, I wrote a very long manuscript. I bet both of you can relate to this since you're both such good historians. And I would have published it, but fortunately I had a really tough editor, Alice Mayhew, who's been Herald's editor too. And she jumped all over me and made me cut half of it. And I'm so glad she did. And she died in February, but I include a memorial page to her. And she was a great editor. And she helped me to find that story. It really, having a great editor helps so much.
Coming back to Herald, why did you, you actually have chapters devoted to any number of presidents, not all of them. So you had to pick and choose. For instance, you don't write about Eisenhower or Truman. How did you pick out, why did you pick the presidents that you picked to talk about their relationship with the press?
Yeah, it was not a perfect or linear process. I guess like Ted, in a world without editors, I might have written a 2-volume book with a chapter for each of the presidents, because there are things to say. And in the case, here's what I decided to do. For the 18th and 19th centuries, I basically limited the chapters to those presidents who had the most consequential impact on relationships between the presidency and the media, if I may call it that. So Washington, obviously, because he sets the tone for everyone. Adams, because he was as sour with the press as he was with his political enemies, and because he ultimately signed and enforced a sedition law that made it possible for the federal government to consider criticism, attacks against the president of the United States, unlawful, and he prosecuted those cases. And then Jefferson, who, stands out as kind of as much a hypocrite in his pronouncements about the press versus his actions, that I thought it was a remarkable story. He's one of the great apostles of a free press, famously saying if we had to choose between effective government and free press, we always should choose the press. But in effect was quite manipulative, quite denunciatory about critical journalists. And in fact, while he opposed the sedition law, he did so only because he didn't believe that the federal government had many rights in terms of laws that superseded state laws. So he was all for prosecuting the press at the state level for libel, and he was quite enthusiastic about that. And of course, he commissioned a reprobate of a journalist, Mr. Callender, to write pro-Republican articles. And then when he refused to reward Callender with a very small federal job, Callender turned on him and published the Sally Hemings story that, of course, did more to haunt his reputation than anything. So I chose the most consequential ones. Jackson, because he imported journalists into his official family and made them speechwriters, advisors, kitchen cabinet members. Lincoln, for obvious reasons. And then I try to get almost all of the 20th century presidents if I could. I left out exciting folks like Coolidge and Harding and Hoover, although Hoover held quite a few press conferences, and the press just didn't like the fact that they had to submit them in advance. Wilson invented press conferences. He invented wide-scale administration propaganda during World War I. Teddy Roosevelt, who preceded him, invented the informal back of the White House interview while he was being shaved, in fact, in the White House. And then I included presidents who revolutionized communications in their ability to bypass the press and to speak directly to the people by utilizing cutting-edge technology. And the most obvious ones, and the ones I dealt with in detail, were Franklin Roosevelt, who used the radio so brilliantly, but also, and less acknowledged, he also used newsreels. He was the second or third feature at the movies in some of the most popular days of the movies. His first radio address was as president-elect was also a highlight in movies during the period when "I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang" was showing, revealing the depths of the depression and the sadness of it. And then Kennedy for television, Barack Obama for choosing the internet over personal relations with the press, which I comment on. I think people might be a bit surprised about how Obama emerges in my book. And need I state the obvious, that for all of his flaws, and no matter what your position about his politics or his leadership abilities, Donald Trump ranks with Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt and Barack Obama as a genius of a particular form of communication, Twitter. It's extraordinary, not only the volume and the intensity of the communication, but his uncanny ability to direct the news of the day with a morning tweet, and the sheep-like ability or inability of the press to do anything but follow his lead during the day.
Taking Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, and Obama, and now maybe I should add Trump, given what you just said. Which of those four presidents do you think were most effective at manipulating the press?
Franklin Roosevelt, who befriended them ingeniously, who got them to ignore and not write about or photograph his disability through what began as a gentleman's agreement because journalists and photographers simply liked the guy, and ended with unchallenged White House rules about taking informal photographs of Roosevelt in his wheelchair, even taking unflattering photographs. So he was able to censor, his administration was able to censor while he remained the good guy. He held 998 press conferences in his 12 years and 6 weeks as president. So he was remarkably transparent about the wheels of government and decision making. Although many things were off the record, reporters were able to ask them to make them on the record, and he often did that. So I would say also in 30-something fireside chats, which were such a pervasive part of the culture in the 30s and 40s, that Saul Bellow remembered walking in Chicago on a hot summer day during a traffic jam and hearing a continuous fireside chat from open car window to open car window without interruption. So Roosevelt was everywhere, and I think he was the great genius of communication, being out there and yet being somewhat secretive successfully.
Along the way, in your story, you talk about how the press, in their coverage of Lincoln, sort of humanized him for the first time. And this is, of course, at a very delicate moment he's trying to get to Washington to be inaugurated, and it's on the verge of what we know it becomes the Civil War. And Lincoln is like, he suddenly becomes flesh and blood. And the press does this. And can you describe how this happened?
I agree. I mean, first of all, the curiosity about him was, I would say, larger than that had followed any president on his way into office. It was overwhelming. Lincoln had come almost out of nowhere, not quite nowhere, because the Lincoln-Douglas debates had raised his profile in Illinois, certainly, and even in the East. And then with the Cooper Union speech, which Harold has written about, his profile went up a little more, but he was still an outside shot at the nomination, which he got in May of 1860. And I think if that nominating convention had not happened in Chicago, his chances would have been much less. And when he got it, and everyone realized he'd beaten all of these more established candidates, William Seward especially, there was just a tremendous curiosity. Who is he? What does he look like? What does he think? What is his home like? And his home appears in prints. Weekly newspapers in New York are beginning to include illustrations, and that's important. And so Lincoln is a kind of political celebrity, and that word was being used. It had been used in some other contexts in the 1850s, and then suddenly the biggest celebrity that America has ever known is getting on a train to come to the Capitol to take charge of a government that is falling apart. And all of these things, the fear, the excitement, the hope, and the criticism, he got all of it. And every newspaper in the story wanted to cover it. And there were tens of thousands of newspapers. I mean, this was a very literate society, especially in the North and the upper Midwest. And so if the train was bringing Lincoln within any reasonable distance of a small newspaper or a bigger newspaper, all the reporters were there watching as he came through. And there are a lot of wonderful physical descriptions of a guy who was unusual looking, not only for his height, but his face that changed its moods quickly, from a twinkle in the eye when he was about to tell a joke to a deep kind of melancholy expression, all within a few seconds and back. And all the strange ways in which he spoke. I mean, he had a Western and somewhat Southern accent. He'd mostly grown up in Southern Indiana, and he sounded like it. So to New York audiences, he sounds twangy and rustic. But he's capable of all these, just as his face is capable of different expressions, his words were also. He could write something very seriously, looking into the origins of the problem of slavery in the United States government. That's the Cooper Union address. But he could give funny speeches. He ran out of material. He'd written about one serious speech per day, and he had to give many more speeches than that. So he had to improvise. And there are moments when it's almost like stand-up comedy, where he's just there saying whatever comes into his head. And he's a quick thinker. And the journalists convey that to a huge Northern audience hanging on every word.
So talk a little bit about the conspiracy. Again, this is not my period of history, but I was really shocked by how serious the conspiracy. And Harold, you might jump in, and I assume you've written a little bit about the early conspiracy too.
So I did write about the conspiracy in my book, and I thought I backed up the historical understanding of when Lincoln and his aides might have become aware of it. Ted backed it up even further and really made some terrific discoveries about why this trip was so dangerous almost from the minute he left Springfield. And he did a terrific job with that. So I just wanted to say that, Ted, before you expound.
Oh, thank you.
One thing, don't forget, you do write about this. Don't forget, he also is growing a beard on this trip, so he was changing appearance. Yes, right.
Great point. And that's a remarkable change in the way he looks. I mean, Americans barely know him anyway, and then he's really changing dramatically the way his face looks. So a lot is happening. It's almost like he's girding himself for battle, which I think is
hiding himself from the danger. Right. Yeah,
right. But Kai, the conspiracy has been known. I mean, there's a great book from the early 1950s, Lincoln and the Baltimore Plot, by Dorothy Cuthbert. She used a lot of materials at the Huntington Library, but Alan Pinkerton, the famous railroad detective, sort of founder of what becomes the Secret Service, wrote multiple versions of all of this. And there were some controversies. Other people in Lincoln's entourage also claimed that they knew different things. But it was known, even, in the 1860s, it was known that he'd passed through something very dangerous. But I was surprised as I looked more deeply into it that most people I talked to knew relatively little about it. I mean, Harold certainly knew everything about it, but most, it wasn't really in the general knowledge. And I found it somewhat uplifting because we all know the tragic end of Lincoln's presidency and of his life. But the nearness of his escape from death in 1861 allowed me to realize, well, we got 4 years of an extremely consequential presidency. And if we hadn't gotten those 4 years, we might very well be 2 countries instead of 1 right now.
Right. So, Harold, coming back to you, I'm curious, how was the research process different for this book than from your previous work? I mean, I see you interviewed Newt Gingrich, and you got Bill Clinton to, I guess, answer written questions. But I bet interviewing some of these famous reporters was a lot of fun, too.
Well, I think the obvious difference for me was that I've never written anything about living people before, at least not in a book. And so this opened new possibilities and was a little bit scary. I did ask several ex-presidents to discuss things, but the only one who did, I'm happy to report, was President Clinton. And I also spoke to a number of journalists. I think I had the last interview with Jim Lehrer before he passed away. And Jim, interestingly, bore no malice or anger about the fact that at one of the more famous interviews that President Clinton gave on the threshold of his, exploding scandal over Monica Lewinsky, Clinton did not tell the truth to Jim Lehrer. And Lehrer's conclusion was he was the greatest communicator he'd ever seen in his entire career. So that made it different. My research was certainly aided by the fact that modern presidents have written extensively about their own presidencies and their own relationships to the press, and also in the oral histories of several administrations, the Carter administration, the Johnson administration, and the Kennedy administration are great tidbits from press secretaries and journalists. And then there were the press conferences. I was able to attend all of President Kennedy's press conferences again, which was a throwback to my youth when I used to run home from junior high school because I knew that there was a Kennedy press conference on in the afternoon. So that was fun to do. And all of Johnson's desultory press conferences, et cetera, et cetera. So totally different for me. Different media too. I didn't just have to rely on print. There was also video. There was radio, fireside chats, for example. So I was excited about leaving the Lincoln period, just as excited as Ted was to enter it. So
it was very easy for me to go back to 1861 and read just about every newspaper in the country because of the Chronicling America database that was co-created by the Library of Congress. And it's an unbelievable resource. And you just drop immersively right in that moment and you see Lincoln through the eyes of some cub reporter like Harold once was. And it's incredibly exciting.
Well, I was particularly interested in Harold's chapter on Jimmy Carter because, as you guys may know, I'm just finishing up a large biography of Carter. And Harold, you're very tough on it. You're very tough on his handling of the press. And I think at one point you started off saying he didn't like reporters.
Most presidents find them annoying and don't like them. So that's
Most
okay.
presidents find them annoying, yes. But also I think Carter had a particularly difficult time coming in right after the post-Watergate era, where I can remember as a young reporter myself, we all wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. We all wanted to unearth some scandal. And so Carter became the brunt of that. And he had these, it was also the birth of the style section of the Washington Post under Ben Bradley and his soon-to-be wife, Sally Quinn. And Sally sort of invented these style section gotcha profiles, which in which she really, made fun of poor Jimmy Carter, particularly for his Southern culture. And so, I was rather sympathetic to your portrait of him at that.
I mean, I think he started off on a high. He got the most famous journalist in the United States, Walter Cronkite, to do an exclusive radio interview with him in the White House. But he made a series of miscalculations, I think, not even in his greatest moments, not bringing the American press more into the Camp David story as it was playing out, although the Israeli press had enormous access to the story, as I discovered to my surprise. Also doing some stunts that were probably ill-advised, his retreat to rethink his administration, his cardigan sweater, so-called malaise talk, which just didn't work. But also, I go back to the staff level. Hamilton Jordan, and you spoke about the Washington Post. Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell specifically snubbed Martha Graham, declining invitations, refusing to return phone calls. That can't be a really good idea for an administration that's supposed to be transparent and a breath of fresh air. It doesn't include icing out the most powerful publisher in Washington. So I think he tripped on his own good intentions in many ways. But if you look back at his conclusions about the press, he believed that the press negativity and cynicism was the worst obstacle he faced in his presidency.
So coming back to Ted, and we're going to have to wrap this up pretty soon. Ted, you quote John Adams at one point saying, "Democracy never lasts long. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." And that's really a rather dour statement. And I can understand, quoting it in a book about Lincoln coming to Washington on the verge of a civil war. But what is your feeling about our current democracy today, having written this book?
I love that Adams quote. When I found it, I've seen a few journalists use it in recent months. And I just think we're all very worried about where this country is going. We're worried on both sides of the aisle. And I don't want to be too partisan in a public event about history, but even though I agree completely with Harold about the significance of President Trump's discovery of Twitter as a very effective means of getting his message out, I totally agree with that. The message is dark and confusing and self-contradictory, and it basically is very quick to blame others and very slow to accept responsibility and very hesitant to accept the moral authority of the position of the President of the United States, a job in which you are trying to better the lives of fellow citizens, lift up the idea of what America stands for to the world, which is a moral idea. It's not just that we are a powerful country. We're trying to stand for a better way of treating each other. And all of those ideas are really feeble at the present moment. And I think we need a profound societal change, and I'm not sure where it will come from. I'm not sure it will come from either party at the moment, but we need to treat each other better. I think we need to get off our social media and talk over backyard fences if people have them, and try to remember the better America that existed not too many generations ago.
I think we have to end this. We've been speaking with Ted Widmer and Harold Holzer. Their books are The Presidents versus the Press, and Ted's is Lincoln on the Verge. They're two very terrific books, well-told, narrative history, and I urge all readers to go out and find them in a bookstore or online and obtain copies. Thank you for being part of the National Book Festival, and thank you for listening.